I'm excited. I'm excited. So, hey everyone. I'm so glad that you all are here with us today. We'll be starting our new series called "What's the Point?" And to be honest, that's a question that I've asked myself so many times that I've lost count. What is the point? What are you doing? What is the point? And in this series, we're going to address a couple of different things. We're going to address what's the point of having an intimate relationship with God? What is the point of having a calling? What's the point of the different things? What is the point of a relationship with Jesus Christ? So today, we're going to start with what is the point of having intimacy with God? That is the first thing that we're going to start with today. And in order for us to be able to dissect this or to go deeply into having an understanding of what it means to have intimacy with God, let's look at an example. So I'm just going to go through 1 Samuel 17 from verse 33 to 40. And this is where David goes to confront or speak to Saul about his encounter, where he's about to encounter Goliath. So I'm just going to go through it quickly because there are a few things that we're going to pick out from this. So, verse 33. So Saul replied, "You are not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You are only a young man, and he has been a warrior from his youth." Take note of that verse. Verse 34. But David said to Saul, "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. The uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who has rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine." Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." Verse 38. Then Saul dressed David in his own tunic. He put a coat of armor on him and bronze helmet on his head. David fastened on his sword over the tunic and tried to walk around because he was not used to them. "I cannot go in these," he said to Saul, "because I am not used to them." So he took them off. Verse 40. Then he took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag, and with his sling in his hand, he approached the Philistine. So we all know how that story ends. And if you don't, please continue reading. It ends beautifully. But what we had seen from here is the story of this young man or this little boy who had gone to approach this Philistine, this great warrior, who, as we had read in verse 33, says that he had been a warrior from his youth. So, what is the first thing that we have to understand about intimacy with God? What is the point of intimacy? Because from this story, we could pick out that David had confidently said that I will go and fight this Philistine. I will take it upon myself to fight this Philistine because he was defiling the army of the living God. So the first point about intimacy with God, or the first thing that we need to understand for the purpose of having an intimate relationship with God, is that intimacy prepares you for a calling. So intimacy prepares you for a calling is the first thing we're looking at, because what we saw, and something that's very beautiful about this, is that in verse 34, David says to him, he says, "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. And when a lion and a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth." So this was David carrying out a daily task, doing something that he was used to, something that he had probably been doing for years and years, feeding the sheep, bending the sheep. But in that daily task, he had come into this encounter. And this encounter was the encounter with the lion and the bear. And here's what his response is. His response, he says that, verse 36, "Your servant has killed both a lion and a bear, and this uncircumcised will be like one of them." Verse 37, this is where his confidence comes from. He said, The Lord who has rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine. So his confidence was not in the fact that he had killed a lion and a bear before, but his confidence was in the fact that God, who he had an intimate relationship with in that time, rescued him from the hand of the lion and of the bear. So it's the same God who had prepared him and had brought him to this place, which we know that from here he would launch the most beautiful, or launch his calling for his life. This was that the incident with the lion and the bear was a preparation for this case. So what we know is that when you have an intimate relationship with God, the day-to-day tasks, things that seem like a daily thing that you just do, in those instances, God will bring things which will prepare you for what he's calling you to do in the future. So when we have an intimate relationship with God, or when we submit our daily tasks to God, they become a daily assignment from God, which he helps us to achieve the calling upon our lives. So now that we have an understanding that intimacy with God prepares us for a calling, the next thing we see is that intimacy actually brings forth fruit. That it is not something that is fruitless, but it's something that brings forth fruit. That when I choose to submit my daily task to God, which prepares me for a calling, he says that in the end, there will be fruit with this. That all these things that you are submitting right now to me, it is not pointless. There is fruit in the end. And I will read quickly from John 15, from verse 4 to 6. So this is Jesus speaking, and he says, I am the vine, and you are the branches. If you remain in me, and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. So this is Jesus speaking to us about something that we're talking about today, and that is intimacy. He says, if you remain in me, another version says, if you abide in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. So there is fruit that comes from our intimacy with God. And when we look at the life of David, the fruit that was birthed was that he became the king of Israel. So in every single moment of submission to God, when we come into this intimate relationship with God, there is fruit that is birthed in the end. The next, I was going to read another verse, Proverbs 3, from verse 5 to 6, which also goes in tie with intimacy brings forth fruit. So Proverbs chapter 3, from verse 5 to 6 says, trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways, submit to him, and he will direct your path. So the Lord directs our path when we submit and when we commit to him. In other words, when we have this intimate relationship with him, he directs our path. And not only does he direct our path, Proverbs 16, verse 3 now gives us an end to what this direction will bring. He says, commit your action to the Lord, and your plans will succeed. So in other words, intimacy with God, having an intimate relationship with God will definitely bring forth fruit. It is not for nothing. There is not pointless. There is always an end in mind. And if you keep on striving, if you keep on pushing in, he says, look, I am not taking you through all of this for you to go to a pointless end. There is always fruit at the end of every striving if you continue in this relationship with me. Then next is that an intimate relationship with God births confidence. I'm just going to go back to the story of David because we get to see him make some very confident and very bold statements. Verse 36, he says, your servant has killed both a lion and a bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them. Goliath is like what? 7 foot something, tall man who was probably well built, who had been a warrior from his youth. And David, this scrawny little kid who probably looked like me, makes this bold statement that, hey, you know what? This guy, he will just be like the lion, and he will just be like the lion and the bear. But His confidence, again, as we had seen earlier in verse 37, his confidence was that in the fact that the Lord who had rescued him from the paw of the lion and the bear will rescue him from this Philistine. So when we have an intimate relationship with God, when we get to know God for who he is, it comes with confidence that we know that this God who had saved me back then is still the same God who would save me again. And to tie that beautifully, that just reminds me of a verse that the Lord had led me to earlier this week, which is Hebrews 13, verse 8. And it's a very simple verse, but that verse carries so much weight. Hebrews 13, verse 8 says, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. He does not change. So when I have an intimate relationship with him, my confidence comes in the fact that in all things, he will always prevail. In all things, he will never change. In all things, he remains the same because I know him so. I can confidently walk into all these different areas knowing that he would always prevail. And alongside confidence, intimacy with God brings about familiarity. And when I was thinking about this point, I just thought about someone who had a drinking problem. If you have a drinking problem, when things are down, you are immediately drawn back to the bottle because it is something that is familiar to you, something that I use to quench my problems, to kill all my issues. So it's something that is familiar. And the question that had come to mind is God the familiar that you run to in your time of trouble? Is God that familiar that you run to? Because we could have so many different things that are familiar that in the time of trouble, we run to those things instead of God. And this is why we need an intimate relationship with him, because we have seen that he's the same, he never fails. So that means in those spaces that we are in need of help, he should be our familiar. He should be the thing that we run back to and not all these other things, because with God, all things are possible. And he lets us know that with me, all things are possible. In a relationship with me, when you run into an issue, I should be the familiar that you always run back to. I should be the thing that you always run back to, not your phone, not the bottle, not these different things. So intimacy with God brings about familiarity. That when we understand that Jesus is the same, if we understand that, it always brings us to the point where we are always resorting to him for our help. Because when we go back to the story of David, we get to see that he had this familiarity with who his God was, that so much so that walking into this new place, or what looked like a new place, was familiar to him. He was familiar with the fact that his God who saved him in the past will save him again. So let me just read quickly, verse 38. Verse 38. So Saul dressed David in his own tunic. He put a coat of armor and bronze and helmet on him. So pretty much he was giving David his entire getup and his entire outfit. And David fastened the sword over the tunic and tried to walk around because he was not used to it. So he says, I cannot go in these things, he said to Saul, because I am not used to them. So this was something that he was not familiar in. He couldn't put his trust in the armor that which was given to him to protect him, because it was not something that was familiar to him. But instead, he put his trust in the Lord, as he said in verse 37. He put his trust in the Lord, who rescued him from the paw of the lion and of the bear, to rescue him from the paw of the Philistine. So without needing any armor, any physical armor, which could probably not save him at that moment, David chose to put on the armor of the Spirit. David chose to put on the full armor that God gives us, because he had put his sole trust in him. So in this place, it looked like he was not wearing any armor at all, but he was actually wearing armor, which is really fascinating, because I'm like, wow, He was guarded, he was shielded. And you see that because he was familiar with God, because of this intimate relationship with God, he did not need an armor, which was most likely going to fail him at some point. But he put on an everlasting armor, an armor that helps us with all our warfare, both our warfare, which we know that are not carnal, but they're spiritual. So that is the point, that intimacy brings about familiarity. And is God the familiar that you run to when you hit the wall? Is God the familiar that you run to in the time of trouble? Is God the familiar that you run to when you are called to do something? Or are you running to other things for your familiarity? Because you can have an intimate relationship with other things, but what would the end be with you putting your trust in men? It says, "Cursed is he who puts his trust in men." So, what is the end in all those things? And this is why we need an intimate relationship with God, because when the time comes for us to fall upon a familiarity, we have fallen upon Him. So, next is, what is required for an intimate relationship? Because when I think about intimacy, I think of something precious. I think of something that needs to be guarded. I think of something. I brought up like a watch, and this is probably a poor example, but to me, this is something precious. This is something that needs to be guarded. This is something that I needed an intimate relationship with. So I watch it. So I move. So I don't tread. I don't miss a day. I make sure that everything is all right. I make sure I brush up. I make sure I check in. So an intimate relationship with God, it requires commitment. That in order for us to have an intimate relationship with God, we have to be ready to commit. We have to be ready to be committed to what God calls us to. And if we go back again, David was committed to a daily task. What is the daily task that God is calling you to? What are the daily things? Is it just reading your book or going to classes? Those are daily tasks. But when we submit them to God, we form an intimate relationship with Him. And when we form an intimate relationship with Him, that is when we get to see that this intimacy had birthed and prepared us for our calling. And another thing is that intimate relationship with God, it requires some form of, and I'm going to use poor English here, but secrecy, privacy. Because something beautiful about the story of David is that no one saw him kill the lion or the bear. We had only heard or gotten that message from word of mouth. So when you have an intimate relationship with God, no one will see you then. That God has not yet called you, has not yet put you in front of people, and He's saying, are you going to be committed to where I'm placing you right now? Because in an intimate relationship with me, you're not going to be seen. And in that space, He says that He prepares us to be seen. So an intimate relationship with God calls for commitment. Are you committed to stay in that secret place? Are you committed to stay in that privacy? And are you committed to just walk with Him through all those daily activities? Then I guess the next question that we would ask yourself is, how do I get there? How do I have an intimate relationship with God? And I think just an easy way to put it is to abide. That when we abide in Him, when we submit daily to God, that forms an intimate relationship with Him. Are you inviting Him into your daily tasks so that He could turn them into daily assignments? That did you know that God could use every single thing that happens in the day to prepare you for your calling? Did you know that? That is what an intimate relationship looks like. That when we submit every of those things, that we build this intimacy with an ultimate God. So I'm just going to run through again the few points, or what is the reason for an intimate relationship with God. So first, intimacy prepares you for a calling. Next, intimacy brings forth fruit. Next, intimacy builds confidence. And lastly, intimacy brings about familiarity. So I hope you have an understanding of why it's important for us to have an intimate relationship with Jesus.
Come on, Seme. That's so good, man. That's such a good reminder. I love it. I think that's just, we're all there, right? We're all at this spot right now where